So our session is being recorded today, and in the coming days, we will produce both a video recording that will be shared via our website and YouTube channel, and we'll also prepare a written summary for everybody. So then, with no further ado on that, today we're going to kick off with a keynote address by Dr. Ian Oppermann. Ian, who was the chair of the Australia 4.0 program in our first year of operation, has late last year, taken up an appointment as a commissioner of the ACCC. Ian is, I think, the first data specialist commissioner of the ACCC. He has a long history, and as with all our speakers today, I'm not going to run through a full bio. You've had access to that and all the promotional material, and we'd like to get on with the session. So with that said, I am going to welcome Ian to the stage and let him continue. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you very much, Jordan. And I'd also like to acknowledge I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as Jordan said, I had the privilege of chairing the Australia 4 series for some time, and now, of course, have taken on the role of ACCC Commissioner. So I thought I'd try and have a little bit of a recap of some of the bigger issues that we've talked about over the course of the last few years, but do so in a hopefully slightly fun way, hopefully slightly engaging way. But there's a serious message behind each one of these, hopefully slightly amusing and entertaining and interesting examples, in that what we're talking about with energy transition, it's complicated. And that's an understatement. It's complicated. It involves many, many stakeholders. It involves technology. It involves issues around policy. It involves issues around thinking about things differently. But we do have precedent in history about technology being introduced and some of the big considerations that we either realized at the time or we now realize that we need to take into consideration. Importantly, the consumer's grid is a really critical element of that. And doing the transition, undertaking the transition with all of the moving parts, with all of the complexity, but bearing in mind the benefit for consumers is what Australia 4 has been all about. But let's begin. And as I warned you, I'm just going to push the boat out a little bit in terms of interesting examples to think about and work backward through time in a little bit. So robotics is an area that's been maturing for years and years and years. And I was really struck recently by the story about this fully self-developed platform, which has an open software development kit enabling customization, integration, and secondary development of this robot called Jaka. And Jaka has 27 degrees of freedom, been newly developed. It's around about 4 feet tall, 1.3-ish meters. So a lot smaller than previous generations and packs a lot into this really light design. Each arm can carry payloads of up to 3 kilograms, and it can handle those payloads with real dexterity and with careful manipulation. It brings together electrical, mechanical technologies, control theory, AI, software, sensors, cameras, and hardware in general, as well as issues of battery and charging. It's a little bit like the child of a mobile phone, an electric vehicle, and Claude, possibly a few other things thrown in. And the range of use cases being considered is very, very broad. And as you can see, it's sitting there next to a child. Once upon a time, robots were put away in a protective environment in manufacturing and in systems where machines worked alongside humans. The machines were strictly cordoned off, or the humans were cordoned off, and they didn't meet. What's being envisaged is a new world where these technologies actually interact with each other, and they have to do so safely. There are also issues of privacy, appropriate use, and possible harms. And in the video of this particular robot, it's seen walking up to that small child with an ice cream, which of course delights the small child. 5 years ago, that was unimaginable. But bringing together all of these technologies in such a small, such a capable package is what's being promoted with this particular new software product, this new robotic product. Now I'm going to switch gears ever so slightly, and you may ask yourself, why are you looking at the mapped brain of a fruit fly when we're supposed to be talking about the energy transition? This is something that happened in late 2024, so going backwards in time just a little bit, where scientists have mapped a fruit fly's brain. And it's not a bit of the brain, it's everything. So an international collaboration of scientists known as Flywire Consortium worked on a project which detailed more than 50 million connections between more than 139,000 neurons, brain nerve cells, in this insect. And they've got everything. And of course, once they map the fruit fly brain, then they can start to do things with it. And fruit flies have been a friend of biological research for many, many years. They are easy to breed. They breed rapidly, but of course they die because they breed rapidly. And you could lose your whole research line simply because of the death of an important member of the fruit fly strain. But by mapping the brain, they can start to do some really interesting things. And since they've got everything of that brain, what they can do is not only map it, but they can model it and they can simulate it. And they can simulate then the impact of visual images, of taste, of motion, and see how that brain reacts. And they're not missing some of it, they've got everything. So they can literally run a digital twin of this particular fruit fly, which is really quite powerful. It means you can see how it responds to these different sort of stimulus. You can see how it responds to an image of another fruit fly, and you can start to ask questions you've never been able to ask before, or know things you've never been able to know before. And of course, this is not just any fruit fly. This is a particular fruit fly. And what's the difference between that fruit fly brain, complete brain being simulated? Is there a sense that that simulation actually starts to think in a simulated way? And I'll stop there in terms of pressing this particular analogy. The point, though, is the specificity and the detail of that mapping means that we really can know things about this particular fruit fly that we could never have asked before. And whilst we're not talking about a human being here, there is work ongoing to map human brains to that level of detail, which means that we can understand things about human reaction to medications or treatments, but we can also get a sense of how that individual's brain works and what that individual brain thinks about the world around it. Let me just press on. It's going backwards in time a little bit. Prior to joining the ACCC some years ago, I was with the New South Wales government as the chief data scientist for New South Wales. And we spent a lot of time building up versions of digital twins of New South Wales. And this particular example from 2021, soon after COVID, we'd done a lot of work during COVID building models of how people and processes moved during COVID or did not move during COVID, as the case may be. And then continued on working with the spatial services folks to build these models of the built environment of New South Wales. And it was a new way of seeing the world. And it was all of New South Wales, or at least all of the geographic areas, and increasingly more of the built environment of New South Wales. And a digital twin allows for better planning, better construction, the ability to understand how things actually work, how they operate, and when you need to do maintenance, because a digital twin is not just a digital 3D model. It's something that brings data in from the outside world and uses that data to sense the world around it and get a better understanding of interaction with the real world, which is very useful for things like preventative maintenance. And over time, of course, this built environment also started to be extendable to the flow of people and the flow of utilities. Think gas, think of other such utilities. And increasingly, that's what we're able to do when we add more and more sophistication to our models of the world, which we build up not only through an understanding of what was constructed, but also how elements flow through that network. Let me wind back in time just a little bit further. There was once upon a time a lot of effort being put into making smarter homes and more connected homes. And in fact, our homes have increasingly become smart. The more connected devices we have in the home, the more we can optimize power consumption, the more we can do things that allow us to live more comfortably in our home. But along the way, we've discovered a few things about what happens when you connect the fridge to the toaster. Are they having conversations about toast? Well, here's this example from 2015 where this fridge was actually implicated in a botnet spam email attack where it was believed to have sent over 750,000 spam emails out to people. of the sort that we used to get, the good old-fashioned spam emails. I'm a Nigerian prince. Please leave $10 million in the freezer and I'll get back to you. This is hopefully a slightly humorous example, but it reminds us that when we bring smart into our homes, an environment where we are protecting ourselves in traditional ways, we're protecting ourselves from intruders, we're protecting ourselves from people door knocking, we're protecting ourselves from all sorts of things. We also need to think about what we reveal about ourselves when we engage with these smart devices. We reveal preferences, how often I go to the fridge. We reveal information about how much the fridge is actually used, which give you a proxy for how many people are in your home. But we also have a potential cyber challenge when we don't know that this thing that we've connected is actually busily impersonating a Nigerian prince and using our energy to try and spam the world. Let me go backwards in time just a little bit more to when the Tesla was first revealed. One of the very, very first electric vehicles that really gave traditional internal combustion engine vehicles a run for their money. So this was in the year 2008, where this is the first time the battery was big enough to allow for that range anxiety to be achieved to the point, to be addressed to the point where it was really usable. So an overall range of over 300 kilometers per single charge. It could accelerate from 0 to 60 miles an hour in under 4 seconds. And it was really very, very successful. And it started to really change the way we thought about what an electric vehicle could do. But it also started to help us think differently about, could this actually be part of the network? Could it be a battery on wheels? Could it be a mobile power supply? Is it something that I could use and get benefit? Or in fact, Tesla could use and get benefit? Or in fact, could it really meaningfully be part of the grid? And these were fairly theoretical questions at the time, but they have become increasingly part of our thinking of vehicle to the grid, vehicle to home, vehicle to whatever. And it's because there were some really fundamentally different things that were done. And interestingly, in all these examples so far, there is a role for standards and electrotechnical standards in particular. But going right back to that robotics example, there is no suite of standards that speaks to what you need for an appropriate use of robot. There is no suite of standards that speaks to the appropriate use of that fruit fly brain, or in fact, even issues around, can I use my car to be part of a meaningful grid environment? And I don't just mean that from an electrotechnical perspective, but from an appropriate perspective. Is there an assurance framework that I should be putting in place for my electric vehicle? Let me wind on a little further. Once upon a time, I worked for a company called Nokia Networks. That's the part of Nokia that still existed. And Nokia was really championing the integration of networks. And in 2000, they made an announcement with their longtime partner, Cisco, that they would move to start to manage all sorts of networks that came in some sort of environment that looked a bit like mobile communication networks. So they were really out there in the lead in mobile networks. But with Cisco and with Cisco's very strong understanding of IP and IP everywhere, they started to develop the idea that there were many other types of networks that could actually be managed in a similar way that you would manage, you would plan, you would do fault maintenance and performance management and optimization of mobile networks. They started to look around at other networks and said, there are similarities between the telco world and many other types of networks, including electricity networks. And so Cisco and Nokia, based on an existing almost 7-year relationship, started to build out middleware that allowed many disparate operation support systems and even business support systems to be integrated. And they started to use standards from TMF, from ITU, from 3GPP, but also from the world of energy networks, electricity networks, to build out middleware solutions that would allow you to start to do similar sorts of things with electricity networks, not just the control planes, but also the information plane, that allowed you to better understand flows through the networks and start to look at some of these newer technologies, such as solar and some of these other non-traditional generating sources in a network. They spent almost 2 billion euros together on this back in 2007 through to 2010 and were wildly unsuccessful with that endeavor. And partly because they realized that it wasn't just the technology, it wasn't the data, it wasn't even the control environments. You could do something similar with a SCADA as you could with a network element in a mobile environment. It was the domains and the worlds that they operated in were so very, very different. Let me keep going. Now I'm really going to try and jump into an unusual space. This is an example of something that happened recently based on an incident from a long time ago. Back in 1951, a woman called Henrietta Lacks had a biopsy because she had really quite an aggressive tumor. And the company that took that biopsy started to use that biopsy sample to try and develop treatments which were relevant to Henrietta. Unfortunately, Henrietta died, but the cells lived. And the company was able to start to create some really powerful cell lines and develop treatments and develop new protocols and new drugs using these cells, which were considered to be quote unquote immortal because they could reproduce and reproduce. The cells would typically die quite quickly in a biological laboratory environment. But these Henrietta cells continued. And the line of cells, the HeLa sign, the HeLa series of cells, have been used for decades since first being taken from Henrietta to build out treatments and to build out protocols. And of course, in a couple of years ago, in 2023, Henrietta's family were able to successfully pursue the company that took that biological sample in the first place in order to get some benefit from it, because arguably they belonged to Henrietta. They did not belong to the company. Arguably, that use case of being able to diagnose Henrietta was not the same as the use case of being able to build out treatments. And they won. After a long battle, they won. After decades, they won. But what if instead the company had built a high-fidelity digital model of those cells rather than use the biological samples? If they had that really high-fidelity digital model, then they could do all sorts of things related to not only map, model, simulate, similar to that fruit fly brain, but they could develop really powerful treatments, and they could start to connect that model to other models, and they could start to do some really, really interesting things in terms of personalized medicine. And again, based on an individual who didn't realize they were revealing a whole lot of personal information about themselves because they were there for a treatment as opposed to being the beginning of a long line of drug development. And the whole point is the personal part. And the last thing I wanted to say before I switch back to something a little more conventional is that standardization is something that we have embraced in the energy sector for a very, very long time. And one of my early favorite standards is, in fact, the predecessor to this one, ASC 112, which was first developed in 1937 and standardized, adopted in 1938, which was the Australian style plug, which was cheap to make. And prior to this, of course, every country around the world was developing their own plug for this new dang-fangled electricity stuff that was being used. But after different regions of the world settled on voltage and frequency, settling on the plugs meant that if you bought a product in one part of a country, you could use it in another part. And if you were going to a country, you knew that a finite number of adapters would allow you to actually use your device in that country because you could build a finite number of interoperations between them. So really, this is a statement that standards really matter in this space, and we will not get to energy transition without standards for the fundamentals, like a plug, but also standards for things like interoperation of complex systems, standards for AI, standards for digital twin, standards for those really complex systems of systems, including when we bring previously quite disparate technological areas together, such as a robot or exemplified by a robot. But Jordan talked about nuclear, Jordan talked about hydrogen. There are standards that are needed for a range of different areas in order for us to make this work. Some of them we've imagined, some of them not yet. Some of them still very much are convergent domains. And of course, anyone who knows me knows I can't not give any presentation with a brief sojourn into standards. I just wanted to highlight so that you know there is great work being done in the world of ISO IEC, which is Joint Technical Committee 1, Subcommittee 41, which is Internet of Things and Digital Twin. So all of those ideas I just talked about in digital twins I hope you already know about them. I hope you understand. But this particular subcommittee has been around since 2017 and are doing an incredible amount of work. And one of the more recent pieces they put forward is the fidelity metric for digital twin systems. And they continue at pace to develop standards. And of course, something else which is really hot at the moment is AI. In Subcommittee 42, they really did wait until 42 was available to form a subcommittee. Subcommittee 42 has also been doing some great work on building management systems and conformity assessment for AI. And of course, AI is part of just about every conversation these days, and it will be an important part of the transition of the energy sector. So what on earth does all of this have to do with energy transition? Why have I just spent 15 minutes or so of your time talking to you about these things? Ultimately, it's not going to be the technology which will be the handbrake on the energy transition. Yes, there is cost. Yes, there is the process of going through physical upgrade or changes to networks. But some of the biggest issues relate to data flow. Where does it go and who sees it? Standards. How do we make it safe and interoperable? And can we even wrap around that one more, which says, how do we know that it's conforming? And how do we put an assurance layer on it? Consumer benefit. The example of Henrietta Lacks is an example of technology being used for arguably good purposes, but without consumer benefit. What about consumer safeguards? What's the equivalent of the Nigerian prince hiding in my fridge and sending out 750,000 emails? And then choice. If we don't decide, the system decides. And if that's the case, then there's something fundamentally wrong with the design. And of course, there's issues of trust, which everything relies on trust. And I will get to wrap up really soon. During the work of the Australia 4, we identified a whole lot of key business and regulatory challenges and a whole lot of key digital and data opportunities. And some of them are really quite obvious. It requires a great deal of analysis, planning and design. But really, customers need the ability to engage with the new grid and benefit from the chain. It's one of the big things we called out, which was not necessarily being addressed by the conversations we were hearing. And then optimum use of new technologies requires access to data from existing sources. And data, of course, is a really important element to understanding the transition and being able to appropriately do it. And of course, we engaged strongly with Standards Australia, the good folks there. We're looking at mapping the areas that need to be standardized, and they are many. And of course, where are the needs? It's not just the electrotechnical components, but it's relevant to miners, it's relevant to ports, it's relevant to grid modernization. And they released some very, very good work towards the end of 2025, which I encourage you to look at. And there was an example of batteries and building safe, reliable, high-performance batteries, addressing issues like energy density, charging, efficiency, and safe features is absolutely the electrotechnical side of things. But the question is, when I sign up to a virtual power plant, who gets to decide when I get to use the energy in the battery that I've paid for? And that's the component which we really, really need to focus on. We also, during the course of the time, spent time working with CSIRO and their National Energy Analysis Centre, and they established this during the period of Australia 4, where they will create or are in the process of creating a living lab, thousands of people in real homes expressing preference, and system science toolboxes where curated data sets can be examined and looked at from the range of not only delivering the service and optimization at a household or at a community level, but also understanding revealing preferences and putting appropriate protections around that. And of course, extensive collaboration in the areas of other stakeholders. And the last thing I'm going to say, of course, with my ACCC hat on, moving from what was the data standards body to the ACCC, there are some really powerful new standards in the domain of originally open banking, now energy, called the Consumer Data Right, which allows ways of sharing data which preserve privacy. And there's a really important new initiative called Action Initiation or Right Access to the CDR, which will enable greater use of your data, of your home, of your billing systems and in a way which allows you to make things happen as opposed to as opposed to just sharing. You can initiate actions. This is still work in progress, and the data standards body is exploring experimental standards within the government, drawing attention to energy switching and real estate application experiments. So there's a lot going on to make the data work for you and do so in a way which is really tries to wrap around the assurance of appropriate. So with that, Jordan, I'll say thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who's still listening and allowing me to go on a little bit of a ride there.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was great. So now, everybody, what I'd like to do is remind you all that we're now going to have a sort of a panel session with lots of discussion. Thank you for all those people. Look at all those wonderful applause going through. And in this session, we're going to have people speaking on this topic from a variety of viewpoints. We encourage you to share your questions using the Q&A function. If you can't see the Q&A function in your Zoom interface, at the bottom of your Zoom interface, you'll see 3 little dots, perhaps in a circle, perhaps not, depending on the version you're using, and you should be able to find the Q&A there. Please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A, and you can also look at the questions others have put in and vote them up or provide comments on them. And we'll be curating and moderating the questions and asking them of the panel as we move through the session. Please don't put your questions in the chat, because we're not going to be looking at the chat for questions. But if you have a particular issue with the session today, or you want to know something about Australia 4.0 or the Pearcey Foundation, or you just want to communicate with somebody else in the room, please feel free to use the chat. So then, with no further ado, what I will do now is introduce Tim Ryan, our moderator for the day, and the man who coined the phrase, the consumer's grid. Tim.
Thanks, Jordan. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. We've got 82 people online and really appreciate the roll-up, and we've had over 150 registrations, so I expect people will be looking more for things afterwards. So today we've got a guest, a list of very good panelists. You've already heard from Ian. Ian was chair of the DSB and now is an ACCC Commissioner. We've got Mike Hewitt, who was the CTO and architect, systems architect for the Smart DCC, or the government owned, operated smart meter platform in the UK. We've got Mark Pearcey, who's a former Rear Admiral of the Australian Navy and a leading engineer and specialist delivering outcomes for examples of how the consumer grid is used. And we've got Hannah Heath, who is a general manager at AEMO, looking at the future grid. And on last but not least, we've got Tim Barson, one of the leading managers at Amber, who is a retailer that is really focused on delivering consumer grid outcomes. So welcome to all my panel. Interesting to see where we've got to today. Ian, if I could start with you as a first question, where do you see the challenges, I suppose, in the system as we've moved from an environment which was supply side only control to being where the consumer needs to try or wants to take access to an agency themselves? So agency was a pretty big topic.
And thanks, Tim, for giving me a chance to speak after that. So there has really been a seismic shift in the way energy systems operate, and going from, this is stating the absolute obvious, but going from large centralized generation to having millions of generators in the system, micro generators with rooftops or a variety of other sources, changes not only how the system needs to work, but also the roles that people play. And we were all used to being consumers, and we were all used to thinking about consumers being consumers. And I think the term once upon a time was load points as opposed to even consumers. And for that to change so dramatically, the change in roles means that not only do we need to think differently about engagement with the network or the network of networks, but also think about all the things that we previously weren't an issue. So the idea of revealing preference because of the way that I use my refrigerator or the way that I use appliances in the house, and the richness of the information which could be shared inadvertently is something that wasn't really possible before. But also the opportunities, thinking about what we could achieve if we could do demand side energy management. That really is potentially quite powerful, rather than designing systems for a maximum or peak load. Being able to shape demand, that opportunity is really quite profound. So there are a lot of different elements to it, and there are quite a few stakeholders in the system, and all of the stakeholders are going through a process of thinking about the system differently and their relative roles. So that was probably really stating the obvious, but it's that fundamental multi-directional change associated with multi-directional flows of energies and changes in roles, which are really the big issues that people are grappling with.
So, Mike, you've you led the technology side of the Smart DCC in the UK, which for people in Australia might not be aware is the smart meter platform and central sort of digital spine. It's now going to version 2 of its implications. We made a bit of a mistake, my perspective, on turning over control of the smart metering environment to private operators, taking it away from networks. So the AEMC has addressed some of that by our real-time data access rule change. But Ian kicked off earlier about saying how crucial data is in delivering outcomes and who's trying to control it and use services. What perspective can you give us from the UK of where you are, where you were, where you're going, and perhaps the challenges that we might face in Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And it's something that just when Ian was talking just made me think. A lot of reference to standards. For me, standards are great, but standards define interfaces. We touched on this as not a technology problem. It really is an architecture problem. And certainly in the UK, it's a pretty gnarly ecosystem we have to navigate our way through. We've got the newly formed role of the NESO, the National Energy System Operator, which typically was, we used to be the national grid. So we've got transmission constraints that we have to deal with. We operate across 8 distribution network operators from an energy perspective, and a number of gas providers as well. And they've all got different outcomes they're all trying to achieve. And then we've got a pretty complex retail market. And then we've got consumers and this rapidly evolving landscape in the home. So I take a step back and think, one of the things I learned in my time in DCC was certainly, we had what was called the SMETS 1 estate in the UK, the first generation of smart meters. Here's the standards, let's just let industry decide. Everyone's got their different interpretation of the standards. And what we saw happen was that as soon as you changed energy supplier, your energy meter wouldn't talk to your new supplier. So we then said, okay, we got this one wrong. So let's create the central body called Smart DCC to act as that sort of the technology platform that links any smart meter to any supplier and to any DNO so they can get the information they need. But even then, in our SMETS 2 world, we still saw different interpretations of standards. And we spent, certainly in my time in DCC, a lot of time working with manufacturers, suppliers, DNOs to try and make sure we got alignment around the standards. So for me, part of that journey is standards are great. We've really got to start to think of that end-to-end architecture that we now need to starting to build if we're going to have a digital spine for our energy system. And that is a pretty complex journey to navigate our way through. I'm using the term at the moment in the UK, the energy operating system that we need that delivers the outcomes. The outcomes got to be less volatility and more consumer agency for all the stuff that's being built, especially all these behind the meter assets.
So, Mike, just touching into that, though, you've engaged with me and adopted the consumers group perspective a bit, but one of your big architectural questions now is how much of this architecture should be directed towards the consumer rather than the rest of the industry. I mean, how are you finding that change happening?
Very slowly, certainly in the UK. And I've been doing and if you look at my LinkedIn post over this week, I'm starting to talk around the sort of architectural journey we're going on. So in the UK, I think the DESNZ, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, have acknowledged some of this journey that we're going on. And they've created this thing called SES, Smart Secure Energy System. So this is from a policy perspective and starting to mandate the standards that we'll need to see the market develop around those behind the meter assets. What I worry about is the standards will come into force probably around 28, 29, ready for 2030. at which point, if we go anywhere near a journey like you've been on Australia, we're starting to accelerate the behind the meter assets, we're going to have millions of assets that aren't cyber secure, aren't trusted, and aren't part of a system, because there's lots of different interpretations of standards. We've seen it in the last 3-4 weeks in the UK. Give Energy was a big battery provider in the UK. That they've gone into administration, and a lot of consumers having pretty poor experience around. Okay, I've no longer got visibility of my assets. I can no longer manage my assets. There are people coming in at different layers trying to support some of those challenges. But it shows what happens where we've got some degree of standards, but we don't have an architecture. So those assets can't talk easily to a new supplier. So it's the pace of change. It's all these behind the meter assets that we need to think about consumer first, agency, and accelerate.
So Hannah, to bring you in there, this is not your area within AEMO. So AEMO went off on a pathway of trying to look to develop the CR data exchange, or CDEX as it's sometimes known, and looking at a digital spine of exchanging information and services. But a lot of that was in the context of the IPRR and being able to dispatch energy resources. And there's still a challenge in there trying to work out where AEMO, I suppose, tries to manage its historic responsibility exclusively around the dispatch of supply to understanding where we're going. Now, we've talked about predictability as one of the things that you're trying to achieve, to think about how the demand side might work. Would you like to, I suppose, build on what Mike has said and bring some of that in?
Yes, I think there's a number of initiatives and reform pathways that are underway at the moment that are really recognising the benefit of flexible demand and flexible energy within the power system. We've got the NEM review last year had a recommendation around a mandatory visibility framework, and through the work that AEMO is doing through our co-design process this year, we're looking at to what extent is there new data or new information that's required to be able to reflect that demand flexibility and provide that market visibility to improve market decisions and operational decisions versus what is already happening within the power system. And therefore it's more around understanding particular sort of consumer choice and consumer flexibility, and therefore what are the different pathways we can capture that information, capture that that flexibility in the way that information then flows through to a wholesale market perspective and those markets. So, trying to improve and understand what are the different pathways using that technology that Ian even talked about, at the beginning. You've got, you've had the rapid pace of technology, the accessibility of solar and batteries at the household level, the affordability of that. You've got AI and technology around how do different algorithms actually kind of help improve consumers' ability to respond and engage without them having to take action to do that. And so how do we pick up all of those dynamics and then feed those as we look at the bigger picture? We've also got the distribution statement of opportunities, which is a new report that AEMO that fits within AEMO's suite, which is really about identifying and quantifying the demand side opportunities that support the energy system and the reliability and security and lower the cost of energy for the transition, or the cost of the transition. So I think there's a general recognition that the small scale and the demand side, the empowerment of consumers in having assets, is playing a really key role in how, they choose to use their assets, how they choose to use energy, how their resources fit and play a really key role within the overall ecosystem. And so now how do we reflect that in the different pathways? And is that understanding and predicting and building that into visibility and recognition, or is that direct participation? And what does that actually look like in practice for consumers?
Well, the interesting segue you've got for me there is we've talked about the DSO and flexibility, but the question is it the consumer's flexibility to do things themselves and surf about what they're doing, or the expectation of parties like VPPs in consumers to be flexible to let someone do something to them. And, that's something in the DSO type, the presentation was quite a detailed thing on a webinar on DSO recently, was really the opportunities were orchestrated around fitting into the current supply side model. So I suppose this is a good spot to bring Mark and Tim in. Tim, you've got a system that's really growing, changing, trying to send signals and prices, etc., to the consumer. Mark, you're an Amber customer, but also, an engineer and someone that has been a leading driver of agency in delivering things yourself. How do these things merge together? And you might be able to cross back over what Mike was talking about, data and accessibility to data in Australia and how we can achieve things. Whichever one wants to go first, alphabetically or otherwise.
Sure, I'll jump in first. Yes, Amber passes through the wholesale costs of power to our customers and enables them to take advantage of low and high price via automation. So we pass through direct wholesale cost, meaning it's super cheap when renewables producing, and therefore they are encouraged to use more cheap and green. We don't make money on their energy. We just make a subscription charge, and therefore we have an EV automation product, which if it's really cheap, sun's shining, or your solar is producing, and then the wind is blowing throughout the grid, you'll find the cheapest time to charge, and that sort of increases demand at that time. And then with the battery or V2G, we can increase supply by there's a price spike in the grid, we export. So we build the automation to take control of that for customers based on their presets and their needs, which is different from a traditional VPP. We do it all sort of for the customer, and they keep all the control and retain that insight. They also have the ability to ingest the live price and forecast, which we have our own price forecast, which is a little more accurate than AEMO's, which isn't really a price forecast. And then customers like Mark or others running their own HEMS devices can automate other things behind the meter to their benefit. And so, yeah, we see this as the fastest way to a renewable powered grid. And then on the data piece, we're really supportive of the changes to CDR to give customers more intelligence about how do they use power, and then that sort of knowledge is power for them to further lower their bills. So that's what Amber does in a nutshell. But Mark can tell you about what he does behind the meter at his place beyond that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks Tim and Tim. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about it is the flexibility that households have. So I run a home energy management system. I get a highly dynamic price from Amber, and that's very reflective of the conditions in my state. So the market operator, AEMO, publishes a regional reference price for Queensland, and they say, yes, we've got lots of abundance, the price is low, or we've got scarcity, the price is high. And what my household does is it uses that inherent flexibility to turn devices on and off. And I'm able to look forward. I'm able to look forward 24 hours. I'm able to look forward to later in the week. So if I can see that there's going to be scarcity on Thursday, it might be overcast, there might be some wind, I anticipate if it's going to be scarce, the price will go up. Now, interestingly, Ian talked about the fridge. My fridge is price aware. So my fridge is connected to the internet, and when we have abundance, the price is low, my fridge turns on, it goes hard. The freezer turns down to minus 24 degrees. The compressor runs hard. When the price goes high, when we have scarcity, my fridge backs back a little bit, and the freezer temperature drops back to minus 18 degrees. Now, it's a really small example because my fridge is just, it's sort of running between sort of 60 watts and 100 watts. But that multiplied by multitudes of households, that multiplied by all the devices in my house, so my hot water does exactly the same. My hot water runs hard when the price is low and we have abundance and energy is cheap and green. And when the price is high, my hot water backs off. Similarly with my electric vehicle, I have a bi-directional charger on my electric vehicle. And so that then contributes to supporting the network and supporting the grid as well as meeting my household needs and objectives. Now, how am I coordinating all of this? I'm not getting dispatch instructions from the market operator. I'm not getting dispatch. My fridge certainly isn't getting dispatch instructions. It's all coordinated around this economic convenience that we know called price. How far do people drive to get free petrol? Well, pretty much every other week I get free energy to put in my car, to put in my fridge, to put in my hot water. And so this, to me, price is the primitive. If you can get price down to the household, if you can get devices that understand price and can do sensible things with price, that's the way to do it. At the moment, my price reflects what's happening across broader Queensland, but I don't actually have visibility into what's happening to my local feeder. So my local feeder could be congested at 5 p.m. and I could move my flexible loads if there was a price associated with that. I currently don't have visibility of that. So this framework and the data that we're talking about, I think price is a key primitive.
So Mark, just at that point there that you've highlighted the difference between network and energy price. At the moment, we're really forced through the construct of the system for the DNSPs to provide their tariffs for the DNSPs to wrap up into a retail product of energy plus garage and deliver it to us. But the point that you've made here about abundancy and pricing is very different, right? It's not the current state, and it's analog versus digital or otherwise. So the networks have dynamic operating envelopes, or have the ability to do it. We're world leaders in that approach. Where do you feel we're going or not going fast enough or slow enough with that, and whether or not the products are being directed towards the consumers that can do something, the group that have automation versus the retailers who may not necessarily be in favour of us saving?
Yeah, it's an important point to make that not everyone's me. Not everybody wants to run a price-aware household. Not everybody wants to be understanding the 5-minute dispatch intervals. And to me, this is where automation, things like a fridge that can consume a price, is the way to go. Now, where does the price sit? There's multiple layers of price. There's the wholesale price at the region. There's the network price, which not a lot of networks are transmitting. They're transmitting a very coarse time of use signal, but they're not transmitting a dynamic price, although some networks are starting to introduce that. And then there's the retailers. And again, some retailers are smoothing and flattening everything out for consumers into a flat rate tariff or a time of use tariff. But to me, there's a little bit of a discussion going on in Australia at the moment around whether pricing should happen behind the scenes, and the consumers don't need to worry about what's happening, because everything will be sorted out between the networks and the retailers and the generators, and consumers will just be presented with a flat price. That's not how we do petrol. That's not how we do milk. That's not how we do airline tickets. If the conditions on the network are different day on day, the price on the network should be different day on day, and consumers' flexibility should be able to exploit that for benefit of consumer, being able to access really, really cheap, abundant energy when it's cheap and abundant, and also being able to understand those points of constraint and being able to actually export, make some money, generate some revenue.
So the AEMC has published its price review last week, and we're all sort of still ploughing through it. You've done a couple of good posts on it. And their focus has been that the DNSP should provide the price to the retailer, right? So I have a view, and this will bring Ian back in here, I think, that the historical perspective of a network delivering energy to us, the construct of a retailer, the whole fungibility of the approach of it, it was natural to combine that together. That's not the case now. You know, the services that we can get from the network, the transparency, the availability of data, suggests really that the network should be able to provide a tariff to us that is visible and is not going to be obfuscated by a network, by a retailer, I should say, or for that matter, that the type of tariff that, say, Tim would want to offer or could be beneficial could be able to be used. And we've got one good example that with Project Edith, where at the moment the tariffs are being corrupted under it, where there's no protection from the subscription or the flat fee to actually say, I've got this much capacity, I can't be penalised. How do you feel about that? And Tim, you might be able to come back in with whether or not Amber's been able to sink in with where Project Edith is at the moment. And Ian, you might be able to tell us where you feel whether the consumer should have access to being able to see prices and do things themselves and not be obligated to have a magician hide the facts. Tim, do you want to kick off first?
Sure. Big supporter in principle of Project Edith and any distributor network tariff that values the network as it should be. So, for example, the network wants more consumption in the middle of the day when everyone's solar producing. Set the price to encourage that. That will compound with a low wholesale price, and even more people will get paid to use energy, as is the case in regions that have a, say, solar sponge tariff at the moment, where it costs very little to use the poles and wires in a fixed time in the middle of the day. If we could be more flexible than these sort of solar sponge tariffs, which will start like Project Edith, that is always good. And if you can pay a little bonus towards Amber customers like myself and Mark, who are able to export when the network wants it, then you're just sort of complementing the existing wholesale benefit. So you get the benefit from wholesale and from the network side. Now, Amber's not yet involved in Project Edith as much as we would like to. The reason being is that currently CCIP has its place, but I'm not sure as to whether CCIP is the right mechanism to deliver pricing. It's definitely capable, but is it overkill? Perhaps. It also presents problems with our billing providers, for example. So not all billing providers are as flexible or as tech heavy as Amber or even someone like Mark, and for them to accurately bill the customer, it takes a little bit of a little extra work to just do 5-minute pricing as it is.
You mean the DNSP to do the pricing, or the
we can receive it. We can receive it, but then we don't run the billing side of the operation. So we sum up what customers have, how much energy they've used, and what they need to pay, but we outsource the billing provision to other companies that aren't quite ready for 5-minute pricing on both wholesale and on the network side. So a bit of that, and I know other participants have had trouble sort of truing that up as well. So there's a few complexities, both with CCIP, how we receive it and how we pass it on to customers, but in principle, super supportive, and I expect we will solve these existing issues and be on board with Project Edith potentially next year. But I think there's going to be a need for further cooperation with all the networks to deliver them what they want, because usually it's aligned with what the customers want. The customers want the lowest price and the cheapest cost of energy, and networks want customers to consume that energy when there's oversupply, or dispatch it when there is a lack of supply.
So, do you have a perspective on the idea of a subscription or the fixed fee having a safe zone where someone is actually, I've subscribed to 2 kilowatts of capacity or 3 kilowatts of capacity? I mean, you're not like the reposits and other parties that are there that are desperate to earn revenue from other customers. So they actually see this as, if a standard model was across all consumers being penalised because they have no control, is an attractive way for them to make money. In the picture where, you're obviously looking after your customer, how do you think a subscription may or may not work? And having low friction, so when there's that's the benefit of the subscription price, when there's no congestion on the network, you can either consume as much as you want or export as much as you want, because that's what the whole idea of a subscription service is, until there's congestion, in which case you go back to your subscription level.
Unsure. I haven't fully arrived at a sort of position on that myself. I think demand charges are outdated, for example, but forecasting for the customer when there's a penalty associated is tricky and something to avoid.
Yeah. So when we talk about capacity charges, I think it's important to try and make this distinction here. Is we're not talking about a peak demand charge, right? Peak demand charges are close to evil, because basically, if there's spare capacity on the network and the energy price is cheap, from a statistical perspective, it's use as much as you can as fast as you can, so you free up space for the next person. So the idea, I might have a 5 kilowatt subscription and I plug my EV charger in and it says, you've got plenty of capacity, you can take 50 kilowatts now. no dramas. And that doesn't become a penalty that lives with you further. Mark, how do you see some of this and how you use energy yourself?
Yeah, so I really like, I guess there's two aspects to it. One is the really high prices. Those days when we hit the market cap, we hit $20 a kilowatt hour. Now, interestingly, in 2025, that used to happen every month, sometimes a couple of times a month. In 2026, it's happened twice this year in South Australia.
And
it hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened in Queensland.
Once. It happened once in Tasmania.
And so what we're seeing is a major shift. So whilst those are the exciting parts of dynamic pricing, one of the more mundane, but I find actually even better elements of dynamic pricing is chasing that low price. And I've got some batteries and I've got an electric vehicle, I've got hot water. So being able to charge those devices at the cheapest time of the day is absolutely fantastic. Now, that cheapest time of the day may move around. There's a question in the thread at the moment around the sort of the solar share offer and 3 hours free in the middle of the day. Well, let's look down the future. What happens when we've got lots of wind provision? And we do see this in South Australia and Victoria at the moment. Sometimes the overnight price can be lower than the midday price. So if you locked yourself into 3 hours during the middle of the day, that isn't necessarily always the cheapest time. So I really like chasing the cheapest price of the day. If that's in the middle of the night because we've got lots of wind generation, fantastic. If that's in the middle of the day because we've got lots of solar abundance, that's great as well. If it's on a Tuesday because Wednesday's cloudy, then that's great as well.
So that's one of the key things with the stuff that you do, Mark, is that you're quite open and saying about buying energy off the grid. You know, I'm not just trying to get it off my roof. I can get it elsewhere. So having that low friction is important. And Amber facilitates that in the same way it does in Eagles. But one of the problems that you've got, Heather, is when it comes to collective action of consumers all of a sudden chasing price change between one interval and the next, if it's in the dispatch environment, generators have an obligation on ramping and how fast they can change or not change. Batteries can change from nothing to full blast in one go, which can have all these impacts. How do you think we can achieve the outcomes of the safe actions of consumers when removing the possibility of sawtoothing or volatility in the consumer action chasing a dollar?
Yes, it's really good question, and one that is very front of mind of a number of the teams across AEMO. So I think there's, so I guess my first point is, yes, you've now got greater flexibility and responsiveness of consumers with their demand flex. And so we already have a market, the ancillary services market, which is about managing those 5-minute to 5-minute dispatch targets from a holistic perspective. And so as we look at how do we build that flexibility and those profiles and that responsiveness into the demand forecasts, and we're working through how do we provide greater visibility of that demand flex and where does that flow through at a wholesale level. But I think it'll also be looking at what is the impact on the ancillary services that sit around, and what is the value that sits within there, and how does that then flow through to understand not just what the cost of the energy is, but then of balancing the system and maintaining the system in that secure and reliable state. So I think we've got a market that's looking at that will provide us some information as we start to get more see more of that flexibility and that volatility. I think what will be interesting, Mike, is for the customers like yourselves who are a lot more dynamic in how you're responding, is to what extent is that a predictable response versus those ad hoc responses, and then again, how does that flow through? And so trying to distinguish between what is a here's a price and here's a number of different prices. How do we understand what the responsiveness against all those prices are, and then think about that at an aggregate level as we've got these cohorts, versus where are individual decisions being made that you can't predict, but are at a large enough level that actually can cause some challenges on how we think about both from reliability and a security perspective, managing the whole of grid system.
What if we had a forward price? I'll bring Mike back in here in a minute as well, give him a heads up. In the UK, and Amber's over there now, they have a day ahead price. Now, that's a capacity market. That's something different. It's not what we're doing. We're not talking in Australia about moving away from an energy-only market. But if we had some sort of a forward market from that moment in time when variable renewable energy actually becomes forecastable, so that the energy is forecastable and the demand side wants to plan against that forecast to use it when it's abundant, the low price that Mark was talking about. That's a challenge at the moment because that doesn't exist in the market constructs that AEMO's got. But that produces the opportunity for AEMO to move away from trying to think about predictability, because you start to forecast the supply now and you're trying to drive energy into it. Do you think some sort of forward market, continuous trading forward market, where the dispatch market is converged on by the forward market is a possibility?
Can I just, before you go to Mike, Tim, can I just talk about elasticity and elasticity in respect to consumer resources?
Yep.
Now, I've done it with my home energy system. I've done it with a cohort of buddies of mine. And I can tell you, for a 10-cent price swing in the spot price, I will the cohort of, say, 10,000 consumer energy houses will consume an extra megawatt of energy. For a price drop of 10 cents, we'll consume 2 megawatts less. And there's a very neat little elasticity curve that you can do. So to me, that could be part of the planning. And I know the Integrated Price Response Resources Project is looking at this. How can we get price responsive resources into the planning and into the dispatch cycle? Now, I think the difference with consumer energy resources, and I particularly focus on the C part of that, is we can predict what the response is going to be, but you can't end up sending dispatch instructions to millions and millions of consumers, because consumers have agency. They may want to run their fridge harder because they've got a party coming up, they're running ice, or they're doing something else. They may want to run their hot water or their pool. But as a cohort, 10,000, 100,000, 600,000 home batteries are all going to behave predictably. You just can't send dispatch instructions. If it's predictable, then you can model it, and then you can use that in terms of an overall dispatch process.
So we're trying to do a number of things together here. One is people being able to plan to be able to manage as they go. Another thing is being responsive to an environment where that's not essential. So, Tim, Mike, where in the UK there's the Octopus Agile product and the Eon Next free phase product, and Tim, Eon's now using your product as well to offer services. Does that ability for the consumer to know a price in the future and act on it, is that, the posts I see real benefits, but what's your experiences of it?
Well, it's still early days. Sorry, Mike. It's still early days in our offer via Eon, but initial results have proven to be quite good. Obviously, if you have certainty in the price, you don't have issues with forecasting. Like, for example, we had in South Australia yesterday or the day before, where most forecasts were that the prices were going to spike earlier in the evening, and a lot of our batteries, mine included, sold a little too early, and we missed out on those giant $20 per kilowatt hour sort of prices for our energy, and that sucks, but we learn from it, and we think it's a bit representative of the sort of changing dynamics in the wholesale market, probably influenced by these nearly 500,000 batteries that have gone in. So it's definitely trickier to do forecasting at the moment, but we will learn and improve. Whereas in the UK, at least in that one market, you have some certainty, and therefore you can make good decisions for the customer, though it lacks some of the highest peaks and lower troughs to take advantage of, at least in that market.
Mike, I just made a mistake in that. It's actually EDF's free phase product, Octopus's Agile product, and Eon Next's Amber product. So just to clear that up, but your perspectives on that, seeing that in the UK different from here?
I think we're on a journey, Tim, in the UK. What I worry about is the more informed consumers that are using some of these more agile tariffs. And they are starting to see the benefits from it. When I take a step back and we start to look at the complexity around the energy system, it feels as though we're trying to apply some fairly blunt instruments to solve what we think is a challenge: pricing. And you sort of illuminated some of those challenges. We talk about herding behaviours that come from pricing. So when I look at Smart Screw Energy System, their answer to herding behaviours is to introduce randomisation to devices, taking some of that agency away from me as a consumer, that technology is going to decide when my car charges and when it doesn't, to try and deal with it. I start to think, how do we take a step back? As I come back to that systems view again, which is we're all on this sort of net zero journey. We're building a grid that's based primarily on renewables. So, zero marginal cost in some ways. When the wind blows and sun shines, we either use it, lose it, or store it. That sort of starts to make you think differently. And I come back to my telco world. We don't buy data by the bit anymore. We almost have a subscription model, small, medium, large. Why can't we come almost to an energy model that says small, medium, and large? I'm a small energy user. I'm only going to pay a fixed price per month, and then we can let the system decide how I get my energy needs met. And I think what's really driving that, it's the fact that we've now got batteries in the home, which great to see the journey you're on in Australia. And I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn. We're going on this journey around local energy policy that came out earlier this year, which is a lot about community energy storage systems. So how do we get batteries into a community serving 500, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 homes? That then acts as another buffer. That then starts to take us towards this different way of thinking. We don't burn coal and buy oil to generate what we do today in the UK at 64% is coming from burning gas at the moment. But the future energy system, we're not paid to burn the oil and to burn the coal. So it's a different model. So why don't we start to think about that rather than just these fairly blunt signals at the moment? And we've seen that, Tim. I looked at the outcomes of the CrowdFlex program that was driven by the NESO. That was originally designed to try and deal with some of the north-south constraints that we've got, which is all the wind's generated up in Scotland, trying to get it into the grid and move it down south to London. There are real constraints there. So the blunt instrument was, let's offer consumers, if they turn down demand between that peak period, they will save a few pence and they get that pence refunded to them. And what we actually saw was consumers actually using more in the day. So they're turning up services. So that mindset that's coming, those unintended consequences of instruments we put in place. And Mark, you touched on it, orchestrating, 30 million homes in the UK, each one of them having not single EVs, but multiple EVs, fleet vehicles, heat pumps, batteries. All of a sudden that's 200 million assets that need to be orchestrated. How are we ever going to manage that in a fair and transparent way? And by fair, what I say is, sometimes it's fair for the grid to do things because they've got constraints. Some things it may be fair for the distribution network operator to do things because they've got constraints. And then sometimes it needs to be fair to the consumers because they've paid for the assets. So a gnarly challenge to navigate our way through.
So Ian in his keynote said it's all about thinking about things differently. You, he and I are all telco guys. So we're poisoned with that well, or we have significant insights that other people may not have. But Ian, the data part here and getting consumers able to make choices and the role of the ACCC. I'm going to touch now on sort of vehicle to grid, vehicle to home, and this preparedness, the ability to soak energy up and store it and being able to make a choice. So the Cheaper Home Batteries program has proved that consumers don't want to be part of a VPP, don't want to be controlled, but they are very prepared to save and use their buffer to save themselves and be able to provide services. Mark's got an EV that connects to his battery, connects to his system, that provides that extra preparedness. Amber's doing really big work and it's just expanded their trial. But we've got all these OEMs trying to say, hang on a minute, that's my EV that you bought and I want to still control the battery and it make a bob. And for me, that's a pretty big question. And I think outside the realm of the AER. That's my perspective, and that it's got a job to do in regulating networks and retailers for the particular, the NER, etc. And the NER. That's the two R's for people that think I've got a stutter. Where do you think this might be with the challenges that the ACCC has looking at digital subscriptions, lock-ins, information asymmetry, etc.? You've been given a big role as the first future commissioner, dare I say, of the ACCC about where we're going to be, and that's an important job.
Thanks, Tim. So a couple of things. The first is that the next report from the Energy Networks from the ACCC will come out quite soon, which has some really interesting information about VPPs and some of the issues that you were talking about, and who's benefiting and who's saving, and what the consequences are, what the outcomes are. I really commend that to you. It should be out quite soon. There are a couple of fundamental principles around consumer protection and consumer rights, which are really at the heart of what the ACCC does. And there are issues around the ability to meaningfully choose and the ability to access information in an appropriate way. So being able to be informed, empowered to understand what's going on in a way which is unambiguous is absolutely everyone's right as a consumer. And it doesn't matter whether it's a children's toy or an energy product. You should be able to see the price. That should not be obfuscated from you. You should be able to make rational, informed decisions to the level of engagement that you want to have. There are, of course, different levels of engagement that people are willing to put time and effort into or research into, but you should be able to, if you choose to engage with that market, or not in the market, if you choose to chase after that particular product. So that's a fundamental, and that's not something anyone should be able to obfuscate. There are a couple of other issues around, well, what rights do I have? And it's an interesting one that you touched on. The right to repair has been something which has really vexed people over time. Who would have thought that in the world of agriculture that you would not have the right to repair your tractor because the company who makes that tractor claims they own the data associated with it and the software that is used to drive the tractor? That's a really different way of thinking about my product and what it is I've actually purchased. Have I purchased the physical object and the right to use that physical object? Have I purchased the right to the data that's being collected? And can I turn on the taps and turn off the taps when I want to because I've purchased that product? Some of that is really clear. Some of it is clear to say, yes, it's absolutely, you have purchased this. You should have the right to exploit it to your benefit. Some of it's less clear because the domains have not really been tested as they well might have been. And just to give you a real example, I laboured a little bit digital twins during my presentation. And there are so many products and services that have digital twins that people are just not aware of. I buy the product. I'm not aware of the fact that that product is either feeding information back to my digital twin, or there is a digital twin which is being essentially used by the manufacturer for things like preventative maintenance. So good reasons. If I don't know that digital twin exists, it's very, very hard for me to make an informed decision around what my rights are with that digital twin. And so I think it's important for people to increasingly be aware of not only what the end user license agreement says, to ensure that those terms and conditions of end user license agreements are not unconscionable, but also recognize where the frontiers of rights are actually moving to. So this conversation, when Teslas first came out, this would not have been an active conversation. Could I use my vehicle to power my home or participate in a virtual power plant? Except in very rarefied environments, that would not have been a conversation. But we've come to be aware of the fact that this is really quite a big deal, and the impact of the potential harm is quite substantial. So having really engaging in those conversations is very, very much a part of the future thinking of the ACCC and the future thinking of, I think, all regulators who acknowledge that there is now a digital and data element to every product and service.
I'm not aware of Tesla having a sale agreement that you sign that says what rights or rights they don't hold after you've sold the device. Mark, I think you've got a Tesla. But the interesting thing there is the point that you made, Ian, was that right at the beginning, Tesla actually made it quite clear you couldn't even plug an inverter into the cigarette lighter to power your home, right? They considered vehicle to load in that fashion as something that they said would breach the warranty, and we're not going to support your car. So this comes to a question of when, and you know, we've had this issue with software licenses and things. You get the end of it and it says agree, and you've like, the only thing you've got to do is scroll to the bottom to it so that it says you really saw the whole lot, like you didn't read it, because you've got no choice to do it. Are we moving to a space where the ACCC will be much more active to ensure that we can benefit from our devices, our technology, and not move to being entrapped?
So anything that involves entrapment is of great interest to the ACCC. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at subscription traps of late during the course of 2026, and took some action in terms of infringement notices for companies that were engaging in subscription traps. And again, it's an area that wasn't really recognised, at least in its current form, 12 months ago, 24 months ago, pick your point in history. And so increasingly, as regulators become aware of a potential harm, a theory of harm associated with the use of data in digital products, then absolutely it's something that regulators are going to step into. It's a matter of, again, thinking ahead about where things could go wrong, thinking about what the theories of harm actually are, and then thinking about which power allows that theory of harm to be addressed. And subscription traps were relatively straightforward in terms of identification of the harm, and therefore which powers are enlivened in order to address that. There are others which are really emergent, and that's what we need to be conscious of. So thinking ahead about what happens when a unique data asset is created, a unique digital capability is created, or when this capability and that capability and this capability come together in producing a new capability which really was not anticipated. It's being alive to those and trying to think ahead into those, which is some of the forward-leaning work that's taking place.
So with AEMO, Hannah, you're trying to, like, getting access to data. There's a lot of things that fall into MSATs, etc., what CDEX was trying to achieve. But, you know, we've had a conversation about whether AEMO, which it doesn't at the moment, whether it needs to have a consumer-facing role that says we have some agency or some ability to tell consumers about how the data, how the energy system works, how the data works, how the DSO could deliver things for consumers. But at the moment, your shareholding structure, the governance structure that exists in AEMO, the consumers aren't in it. They're just not in the picture. Does that represent a challenge for you in the work you're doing in Future Group? Not that I want to drop you in it terribly.
No, I don't think governance structure, you know, an existing governance structure means that consumers are not at the forefront of what we think. We just released our corporate plan last week. And, you know, AEMO's core purpose is about helping deliver reliable and secure energy and affordable energy to consumers. Like we exist because we are facilitating markets and operating power systems for consumers. Without consumers, we wouldn't need to exist. So, you know, I don't think you need, whatever the governance structure is, that is the core to what we do and how we do it. So yeah, I don't think that hinders it. I think what we're working through at the moment is AEMO is set up to be a wholesale, to look at things at the wholesale level. Like we look at things in, you know, multiples of megawatts. Individual consumers deal in, well, they deal in kilowatts, but at the end of the day, they actually consume energy to derive a purpose and a value, and to get an outcome from that. And so I think as we look at the different ways that consumers engage with energy and use energy and think about energy, there is, you know, a question that we're working through to what is it that AEMO can do to help facilitate, and whether that is a price, whether that it's a, you know, exchange of information, whatever that is, to then help the decisions that are getting made, either with consumers who choose to participate with a retailer, choose to respond in whatever signals that they are receiving. I think that's probably where the challenge and the evolution that we're going on at the moment.
Megawatts versus kilowatts type thing, I think, is a real issue, and it's one of the challenges of the IPRR stuff. Both Amber and Mark have made submissions around the IPRR. In the original work with it, aligning with what the Nelson review came out with, it had a real focus of delivering data to AEMO, but that sort of got lost when it changed from being scheduled light to being the IPRR. You know, I'm not quite sure who coined which part of it. Scheduled light was certainly the AEMO term originally, then someone moved on to something else. But IPRR has a fundamental principle from the megawatts thing of a dispatchability and not being consumers able to drive things. So how do you find that affects Amber and what it's trying to do, Tim, and how do you find it how to work? Because the question is that 5-minute spot price the best price to do it on the basis it's trying to manage those big lumpy things? Or is there something else that you want visibility because consumers doing it? We're seeing that already. We're seeing that with the cheaper home battery program. If the duck's gut's being eaten and its neck's being wrung and no one is being paid for it, the consumer is benefiting them individually and they're benefiting everybody else. And that's a good news story, but we're not telling it. Or at least I am. I don't know about everybody else.
So that's a question for you, Tim, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Could you please repeat the question?
No, don't do that to me. No, like no. So
Tim, maybe I could just interpolate a question from the audience here.
Perfect.
That I think ties in with what you're asking in a slightly different way and hose back a little bit to some of the earlier remarks that Mike made. So there's several people have asked questions about this issue of what comes first. Do we decide on the roles and responsibilities of the different players in the marketplace and then set up a system and an architecture that allows those to happen? Or do we optimize the architecture and systems of the whole environment, and then as a result of knowing what an optimal operational looks like, do we then assign down different roles and responsibilities through the layers of the system? So in some senses, I think that question is similar to what you were just asking, but I just wanted to make sure that it got expressed.
No, that's a good point, and probably Mike's got more of the ability in that. But the interesting question will then be also Amber's charging people a subscription and then continuing to do all the software development and things around it, which depends on a system. So, Mike, Tim, would you address that question that Jordan was just asking?
I think I can provide a little insight. We really try and do both at the moment. We're operating within what we have, which was 30-minute pricing, and now it's 5-minute pricing. And that change delivered slightly better results for customers. So automating batteries and EVs within the constraints of the system setup that there is today, and adapting to new opportunities to deliver maximum value to customers is what we do, because that's how the subscription works. You give us $25 a month, we'll get all the value we can. And so there's new opportunities around, Project Edith, other DNSP sort of two-way tariffs, FCAS market, exploration, flexibility markets. We want to soak it all up for customers that is available today, but also influence, if we can, policy and rules by making these RPRR submissions and whatnot to help craft the rules and the regs in a fashion that really does serve the customers. Like Mark mentioned, the price elasticity is part of our submission, and enabling customers to make the most of it on one side, and then trying to change the rules to better benefit them on the other. Mike might have an extension or a different view.
Yeah, Mike, and you might pick up from the comment you've already made to Wayne Fitzsimmons as well about the digitisation body, and is that a consumer body, or is that a technical body, or is it whose interest does it look after?
ultimately a delivery body to make sure it does happen. We sit in the middle of a highly regulated sector, and there are challenges around that. I think, Hannah, you touched on it. Consumer outcomes. What does the consumer want? We operate in the utility space. The consumer wants, I flick the switch and it comes on. I turn the tap on and water comes out. That's ultimately what we want as consumers. Ideally, I think I'd like less volatility in pricing and maybe a little bit more certainty. Now, there's challenges around that. So, the regulator should be starting on what is the consumer interest and how do we work back from that. But there's a lot to unpick in all of that. We're sitting in a sector which works on decades of infrastructure delivery programs. We've got a retail world, Tim, which is you can only operate within your license obligations and your regulatory environment, and that comes first above everything else. So that's why I come back to, and underneath all of that, this is all driven by political will, and they've typically got a 4-year window, certainly in the UK, that they think about. Maybe less than that at the moment. We're on our 7th Prime Minister in 10 years, I think, in the UK.
Yeah, we've done better than that. We're probably on 10.
So there's some policy stuff in there as well. For me, it comes back to, right, let's understand what the outcome is we need to achieve. And that might be we talk about net zero by 2050 in the UK. We'll put some big numbers in there, get rid of ICE vehicles. But to get to that net zero by 2050, probably every 5 to 8 years, there's probably some things we need to have unlocked. And for me, the first one is digitization of our energy system and an actual proper joined up approach to the data that underpins all of that. So to digitize energy system, we need to do things over a period of time. So it'll be around standards, it'll be around coordination. We touched on it with open banking. There are some good lessons from open banking and why that did work, and certainly across the EU, and why the UK probably did a better job, because we put this delivery body at the middle of it all to say, you've got the mandate to make it happen, and you've got the teeth to make this happen. So that unlocked an awful lot of it.
And you've had action initiation from the beginning, correct me if I'm wrong, Ian, but it's fairly early days. The UK had action initiation with their open banking, where we've added it just recently. Peter Kilby asked a question, which sort of leads into this, for Hannah and Mark. The SSO is about to start in a week's time or so. Supposedly everyone's going to get 3 hours of free energy in the middle of the day, irrespective of whether the sun's shining or it's pouring with rain or whatever.
Not everyone. But keep going, Tim.
Not everyone. Who doesn't get it?
You have to You have to change your retail. You have to change tariffs.
Sorry, that's what I'm getting. If you want to, you can jump in and do it.
If you want to have it, you can have it, but not everyone automatically gets it.
No,
big difference, huge difference, millions of people's difference.
Absolutely. At the moment, there's no one on it, and they've got to change to get on it. The question is, I suppose, we've had some of these as commercial offers already, and we've seen one of the things that in the Facebook groups and things of people comparing Amber with some of the other retail offers that are there at the moment. There are people trying to take advantage of those within the wholesale market environment and free, etc. But let's say lots of people take up that offer. Let's say people are convinced it's a good thing. How do you think it will affect what you see? Will the duck's gut be eaten and the prices will be coming up? And what's going to happen at other times? And Hannah, I mean, it's probably no one wants to be negative about the SSO as such, but it must have real challenges for AEMO come the 1st of July, or let's say it's the 1st of August when there's 50,000 people sign up.
So we're doing analysis on that already. So there's actually, I've got a pack today looking at one of the existing retailers who've got one of those offers to just try and do a bit of an understanding of, what the behavioural patterns and changes are. A solar SOCA offer will drive behaviour changes for those who sign up to it. It is an opportunity for those who, a lot of the conversations we've been having today are about those consumers who do have the technology, who do have the investments in order to be able to change their behaviours, but that is not everyone that is connected to the power system. And I think that's also quite an important thing for us to remember when we're talking about different plans and structures and information and flexibility, is that not everyone has the ability to be able to do that and get those benefits. So solar SOCA offers are designed for those customers. We're seeing that there's a shift of load So there is there is an increase, there is a ramp up of load in the middle of the day for those customers. It does change their profile. I think what we're working through is, what does that mean on the days where the sun isn't shining? And so there isn't the solar to soak up, and how does that flow through? And I'm sure retailers are having a similar think about that as well, as they reflect on what it means for their profile. So the short answer is, we're already doing analysis today to try and understand what the implications are, so we can be ready for it and factor that in.
So in Victoria, which as a dual fuel state tends to have a lower after diversity maximum demand design of its network, and therefore I don't like the word fragile, because it's not fragile, but it can face challenges with voltage if there's sudden variations in loads. We've heard of the ONO-OVO effect down there, where basically people on a feeder, if there's enough EVs that are all timed to turn on at 11 o'clock for the over 3 hours, the voltage drops, and depending on the EV or the charger, the session is ended when the voltage gets too low, and then it doesn't re-establish. I mean, it's outside the scope of our email as such here, but that is obviously a difficult question.
Yeah, can I just jump in there, Tim?
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, I totally agree with Hannah that I think solar share is fantastic to see some policy settings that are for people who don't have the wherewithal to have solar or batteries. The battery scheme, you had to have solar to get the battery, battery scheme. So to me, having some policy settings that are able to address other parts of the community that are locked out, renters, strata, apartment dwellers, those sorts of things, I think it's fantastic that there are those sorts of that policy settings are going that way. We've also got this huge overabundance in the middle of the day and a lot of curtailment going on. Now, some of that is economic curtailment and some of that is constraint curtailment in terms of interconnectors and feeders. And so I think in that regard, it's good policy as well. But you're right, the power up at 11 is going to be a challenge. And to me, this is where dynamic pricing can be relatively better. So rather than having a hard changeover of a time of use tariff at 11 a.m, which we have in Queensland, the network time of use tariff drops to 0 or half a cent at 11 a.m. If you had dynamic pricing, then the prices would gradually increase and gradually decrease, and different people would come on and come off the network at different times of the day. Everyone wouldn't come on the network at a particular point in time. And I think this is where dynamic pricing can be that saviour, because it'll just graduate. At 5 minutes to 11, it might be a little bit lower. At 10 minutes to 11, it might be a little bit lower than that. And that's how you get this diversity of people coming on and coming off if they're price responsive.
Do you think you'll see an impact on your business, Tim?
I don't think so. I don't think it's quite the fit for the Amber customer. With the Amber customer has a battery or VDG, or at very least an EV. If these plans have been around for a little while already, just not mandated by government, as you've alluded to with the OVO effect. So I think if you are the type of customer that has that predictable load and can plug your EV in at times that are going to be free, then you're looking for that sort of plan. Sorry, getting a little bit of feedback from Rosemary, if you want to mute yourself. Our solar share offer will not be anything special. It'll come with sort of the 3 hours of free power and a subscription charge and sort of higher rates outside of those 3 hours. It's not really for our customer, and they won't get all the upside from the the high prices come with high feed-in tariff. So
I was thinking it's your customers largely and a couple of others that have really driven the beneficial effect of the cheaper home batteries program. They're soaking up that middle of the day price, and they're lowering the price at the end of the day. And to Mark's point about a price elasticity curve. So I'm just the question wasn't so much about you winning or losing customers, but do you think your customers will move more into understanding that the spread is going to decrease and that their real value is in saving. Mark's already talked about this extensively online, that the real value now is in saving, not in trying to make money out of peaks. Is that having an effect in how Amber sees the market, its marketing, and the work you're doing with Inside SmartShift? I mean, SmartShift is one of your domains.
Yes, I mean, as Mark has said here and elsewhere, the heyday of those regular high price events are likely behind us. I'm in SA, so they might continue a little bit more until we have another interconnector. But that said, there's a bunch of change happening in the grid on the demand and supply side. It is more about saving now, and I would always, I came from the solar battery world myself, you would always size the battery for self-consumption primarily, and that both now and into the future when you have an EV. So yes, a little less focus on the earnings on offer, though we do wish to bring them back by bringing on these other revenue streams for customers, as I mentioned before, FCAS, flexibility markets, etc.
Just to take that through a bit further, with the work that Amber's doing on vehicle to home, and it's vehicle to home, not vehicle to grid, it's the extension of it. Are you seeing that in people adding it on top of their battery, so they're just increasing their preparedness? Or is this about consumers that have only an EV and don't have a standalone battery? Where is the trials and the learnings that you've already got so far at Amber?
Yeah, sure. Most Amber customers already have a battery, and they're the ones that are super keen. We have a wait list of about 7,000. More than half are not Amber customers, but those that are early adopters and keen to get on board with vehicle to grid and have a compatible car at the moment, which is the BYD Atto 3, which is warranted for all our participants. So expect that to have other brands coming on board soon. Many of them already have batteries, and that means that they already have much of the vehicle to home savings realized by their battery. So their earnings are sort of in winter when there's consecutive days of not much sun, and they can sort of top it up or supplement it, or during these high price events, which you can then export more energy if you have your car connected as well. So we're seeing a bit of a mix, but maybe 50-50. However, a lot of them are exploring getting a battery now, and this is playing into that decision. And some, like Mark, have an all-in-one unit that is both battery and V2G charger combined. Interestingly, we're also getting much more like 50-50 three-phase, single-phase split. And that's probably representative of the sort of all-electric home that Amber attracts. So you have more power demand, you have an EV and a battery, you're probably more likely to have three-phase. And we're seeing some of the constraints that the DNSPs particularly have put in around sort of total power connection. For example, a lot of the Victorian networks allow you to have, say, 5 kilowatts of solar and a 5 kilowatt battery. Well, if you have just 5 kilowatts of solar and a 7.4 kilowatt EV charger, you're not allowed to connect that at the moment. So we're working with various DNSPs to understand that the value to them is there if they allow V2G to connect, and that there's more value to them, as in more power, we could give it to them when they need it if some of these rules are changed, whereas certain areas allow more connection in total, giving us the ability to give customers more money and the networks more of what they want.
So the interesting thing there you've mentioned about the war. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt again. Just as we're heading into the last sort of period of this conversation, I wonder if we could shift a little bit from talking about sort of policy and big regulation and stuff. A lot of the speakers have identified a number of challenges, but all of those also are opportunities. So I wonder if we could just explore, if we were going to have Australian innovators in the ICT and energy sector coming up with new solutions. So we've got Tim here from Amber, a great example of one company who's done that. Mark has implemented systems in his house using certainly using Australian software. Are there hardware and software opportunities that the panelists can see that Australian innovators could be developing right now to enable the change of the market, to make the consumer experience more of what you guys have been discussing, to give the infrastructure side, the utility side, better access to what they want to do. Where are the opportunities for Australia to create innovative economic outcomes? Or is that just too hard?
I'm quite excited about the unlock that V2G offers renters and people that can't get solar. For, as Mark said, you can't get the battery rebate if you don't have solar, or you don't need solar with Amber in several states. You can just, or with the solar share plans, where you can charge in the middle of the day and then eliminate your electricity bill that way. I think V2G offers similar upside, and I think balcony batteries that we're seeing take off in Germany, among other places, give a real opportunity for renters, particularly in this sort of cost of living crisis that we have, to really take control of their energy somewhat. I think there's some big opportunity there.
What do you think about virtualization, Tim? About people being able to charge from their car parked on the street, being able to charge from their home or dispatch energy to their home just by simple virtualization of NIMIs and account numbers, like is already in the NER and in MSATs. Anna can probably talk about it a bit with either virtual NIMIs or logical NIMIs allow us to do it. Have you guys explored any of that as a retailer, looking at how you might offer virtual network type services or otherwise?
Some of our partners have. I think it's got a lot of potential for certain customers with EVs and or V2G. It's a billing problem to solve, I think, and it's not one that Amber has focused on as of yet, purely because we are resource constrained. But some of our partners are exploring this, particularly in the EV space, and we are consulting with them on how that it could work with Amber. But it's has a bit of focus.
Are they the type of companies that Jordan was just asking us about? Is that where some of this innovation and things is coming from? Is those types of partners looking to you?
We're talking about sort of EV installation and fleet operator style companies that are the ones that, top of my mind, have engaged me before.
Mike, what do you see in the UK with this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Tim B, you just touched on this a minute ago, which was around the role batteries are going to play. And I am wondering if we are at that inflection point now. The reason EVs has got to where it is today was that inflection point probably a decade ago with Tesla. It wasn't the induction engine, it was the ability to be able to put the batteries into cars. We're now starting to put batteries into homes. It was really interesting yesterday in the UK, Octopus have launched a couple of new products. One was their Octopus Nook, which was, Tim, you just touched on it, that sort of balcony battery, being able to stack pluggable 2 kilowatt battery modules into the home up to 10 kilowatts. They also launched Colossus, which was their 5 to 30 kilowatt battery system. And I love this one. They also, they are marketing geniuses. They also launched Swaptopus, which is swapping out EV batteries, primarily looking at the transport sector. So I do think we're at that real inflection point where batteries have got a significant role to play in our energy journey. And I wonder if that retail market is really going to change with, rather than being the sort of meter to cash, you're now becoming that sort of infrastructure and software points in the home. So it's no longer about just billing. It's going to be about that sort of infrastructure operator in the home, that trusted relationship with customers to operate the software, to deliver the agency, to deliver the trust, and whatever that future grid starts to look like, delivered by all these distributed assets. That could be a real inflection point around that retail space.
I'd also like to, Tim, if I can, just jump in on the innovators and what do Australian innovators need. I run an open source software stack. I run an open source C-STEP Oz client. I run an open source linear programming model, both developed in Australia by Australian developers. Now, one of the key essential elements for this is we don't want to get vendor lock-in. We don't want to end up in walled gardens. So we need open standards that operate and provide open interfaces for a lot of this consumer energy resources. If your consumer energy resource doesn't have an open interface and an open standard that it can be interfaced with, it'll be sitting up in the cloud and you'll have exactly what happened with my garage door. My garage door was part of my open source ecosystem, and then the garage door OEM decided that they didn't like people accessing through the cloud their environment, and so they just cut everyone off. And this happens time and time again. People get into cloud ecosystems. The vendor 5, 10, 20 years on can no longer maintain that cloud infrastructure, and equipment and consumer energy resources just stops working because the vendor doesn't want to continue it. And,
Okay,
and to
so
me,
that's a great segue to Ian. Maybe we're getting close to finishing up, but Ian, that comes a little bit on right to repair, but also access to my system, right? So I'm a big fan of Sensibo as an air conditioning control system, but I've got one major gripe with it. It is cloud only, right? And if it fell over, I think it's, God forbid, it's too successful to fall over, but it's limiting what you can. Yeah, I know, Mark. What you can do. Where does that take the ACCC and saying openness, interoperability, the facets that were so important for what you did at the DSB? Where do we actually get that? Is that something that's going to be a key digital requirement?
Tim, you asked me all the right sort of questions. There are multiple elements to it. One is that platforms have moved to being designated entities which need to require ex-ante protection. That specifically relates to things like scams and harms, but that's a relatively narrow perspective. It's not inconceivable that when you are dependent on a platform or cloud provider, that same sort of consideration might arise in future to avoid exactly what Mark was just talking about. Unfortunately, we have to be aware of, collectively, we have to be aware of the potential harm before we can do something about it. And again, line up the particular piece of legislation which gets empowered by response to that harm. But I think increasingly, the more that we have conversations about what could be possible and develop more data and digital driven theories of harm and frameworks for thinking about consumer protection, I think you will see more and more people, the ACCC, other regulators, taking more proactive steps to say, we've created a dependency. We need to make sure that we've got a protection for that dependency.
Do you think that fits in with AEMO's role, Hannah?
It's something we're quite front of mind of. I mean, we work closely with, the AER, the ACCC in different areas, the AEMC as we think about, the consumer protections, what roles we have, data privacy, security, cybersecurity. So I think at the end of the day, we need a grid system capability, CEO interface that actually works for consumers. And it's looking at what's the right infrastructure, foundation, frameworks that enable that to happen. So
I mean, as you know, most people know, I've been fairly critical of CDEX at different points in time of trying to take too much control of consumer energy resources. But it sort of just occurred to me in the context of that discussion that at the same time, if you look at it with a different lens, or you're trying to not necessarily look for the problems, we can architect things, to go to Mike's point, we can architect things that says, I'm actually trying to deliver the consumer outcomes. And that's not something that I think AEMO did in the CDEX process, but there's no reason why it couldn't.
I'm going to take that one on notice and back to the team.
Tim, I had two other sort of wish lists. One of them data related, the other sort of more accounting related. One of them is everyone has a meter on their wall, their retail smart meter. CDX goes one way to enabling customers to use some of that information, but that information is stale. You get it a day late. It is perfectly possible to get that live meter data, which has so much more value to customers to build tools around. And enabling that would be a step in the right direction. And my other sort of gripe is the controlled load tariff, which came, is a separate line into your house and never is served your hot water via your solar. And if we can balance that metering for customers, then they can self-consume more of their power instead of exporting it for nothing and then paying to heat their hot water.
The AEMC meeting review found clearly that the data was ours. The real-time data access rule changes made it clear that we've got a full entitlement to real-time, at least 1 hertz, if not faster, access to our data. And we can also pass it on to someone else. So in the context of Jordan's question, you know, I'm thinking there's people out there already developing an MQTT mosquito server to catch that data and pass it on back to Amber Direct or to the DNSP to create a DOE, the sort of thing that Mark Peter Kilby's after. So how do we drive that, and how do we, like in the context, Mike, of the stuff you've done in the UK, does it need to come to a central source, or does the consumer can actually get their data and send it on to someone else, and that power is, you know, beneficial to everybody?
Yeah, no centralization, please. Distributed at the edge. Yeah, there's challenges around that, isn't there? You know, that frequency of data when you want to get close to real time. You know, 30 million homes all transmitting. You know, it's not huge packets of data, but there's still a lot of it. It's all got to go somewhere. So I think we've got to look, you know, again, system architecture. How do we move more of this to the edge? And by the edge, you know, in a 2030 world where a lot of AI capability is shifted from centralized towards the edge, you almost come back to critical national infrastructure. AI at the edge, that is a secure domain where it can orchestrate things at the edge. That might be home information from your smart meter into your DNO to deal with constraints on that distribution network. That's the intelligence we need at the edge, not centralized.
Yeah, and we don't need to, if you've got 50 homes on a feeder, we don't need every home to say, here's what the voltage is every second. So they're the sorts of things that we can better understand about how we aggregate data together. We're running right up against time. Has any of you got any sort of parting comment or insight that you'd like to add to where we are today? Hannah, ladies first.
I think we're in a really good spot of being able to actually, you know, recognize the value that consumers can play. We've got the technology, we've got, you know, we've got the processes available to try and actually look at how do we do this for the future. I think one of the things that will be quite critical is how do we think about the regulatory frameworks that we don't presuppose that we know what the future is, and we look at how do we build some flexibility within those frameworks so that we can enable the innovation, the evolution of both the technologies, the solutions, the opportunities, and don't inadvertently clobber those.
Mark, what do you want as a consumer?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I think consumers have demonstrated simultaneously that they're highly engaged, 4 million rooftop solar, 600 home batteries, and completely disengaged with VPPs. So consumers were a fickle bunch. I think price is that primitive is something that I really drive for. And I think the low-hanging fruit in terms of household and consumer flexibility is just such a vast, untapped resource. If we can motivate consumers, I think that will go a long way to providing energy system security, lowering the system cost of ownership, and giving everyone in this country cheap energy, higher productivity, and a happy place.
Mike, what would you take from us and what would you give us?
For me, I guess data is the next utility. It's the one that's going to unlock innovation, but data not in a silo. Data now spans energy, water, transport, finance, agriculture. And we're always thinking of it in silos. How do we build the infrastructure that enables us to share data at scale with consumer trust behind all of that sharing? And
Tim, you get last throw.
I think Mark's point on price being the ultimate influence on consumption via either automation or behavioural change is pretty strong. But also I'm very, very big on data, and knowledge is power.
Ian, you started us off. You can.
I'm just going to go +1 with Hannah. I think the engaging in this conversation and thinking about the consumer at the centre is absolutely critical to make sure that this is net benefit Australia as opposed to value being captured by any one party.
So, Jordan, am I throwing back to you for the farewell for this?
Yeah.
Yep, perfect.
So thank you all. So I hope you'll all join with me as you are. I can see all the applause coming through. Thank you to Ian for the opening remarks. Thank you to Heather and Mark and Ian and Tim and Mike for being our panelists, and for Tim running the panel so ably. It's a challenging topic. It is easy to get distracted by some of the big challenges of policies and regulation, but it's also important that we keep coming back to the pragmatic of what can we actually do and change now, so we don't get lost in the paralysis of analysis that so often happens with these complex systems. Thank you all for coming along. As I said, we'll be making the recording and the summary available with a little bit of help from AI to slim it all down as soon as we can. It'll all be available via our website, and everybody who has attended will receive an email message to let you know that it's there. Once again, please join with me in thanking all of our panelists, particularly Mike, who got up very early in the morning in England to be part of this, and to everyone else who has travelled to be here with us today. Thank you all.